Welcome back to part 2 of our exploration of Darwinian evolution and neural networks in Unity. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, I highly recommend you do that first, as I'm going to discuss features of neural networks that might only make sense with the added context of part 1. To briefly recap, I've combined the concepts of natural selection and computational neural networks in order to see what kinds of complex behaviors can evolve for simulated agents, given only survival constraints and random mutation. Going forward, I'm going to avoid calling the objects in my simulation creatures, because they aren't actually constrained by any biological or metabolic limitations. They simply think and do. They're decision engines. And so I think the more proper term for them is agents. In part 1, the only survival constraint I had implemented was a sort of selective breeding ground, wherein if an agent found itself at the end of a generation, it was able to pass on its genes to the next generation. And if an agent did not reside in the breeding ground, it did not pass on its genes. This condition by itself yielded some fairly complex analogs to natural phenomena, such as the persistence of behavioral traits that were ancestrally relevant but useless to the current generation, the accumulation of junk genes that didn't do anything useful but didn't harm an agent's reproductive success, and the emergence of adaptive novel genes in genetically homogeneous populations suffering from the founder's effect. In this video, I'm going to discuss 2 new survival criteria I've since added to the simulation: food and environmental hazards. Before I get into that though, I want to repeat a useful heuristic from part 1 that should guide our understanding here, and it's one of those deceptively obvious facts that's actually quite profound, and that is that if you randomly encounter an animal in nature, you can be fairly certain of one of 2 things about that animal's species, just by the mere fact that you've encountered it. Either it reproduces a lot, and so there are many copies of it, and the chances of running into one are good, or it lives for a very long time, in which case again the chances of encountering it are good. One other incredibly important and related concept you should be familiar with is that of the selfish gene. Richard Dawkins discusses this at length in his book of the same name, so I won't attempt to explain the entire concept here, and I may need to do a whole video on the subject in the future, but the upshot is this: genes that find a way to copy themselves and don't otherwise interrupt a creature's ability to copy those genes are genes that persist. It is both simple and profound for what it means about what our genes are actually doing. If it can be said that genes care about anything, and it's always linguistically risky to attribute motive to inanimate things like genes, then they only care about copying themselves. They don't care about the livelihood or the happiness of the parent organism that they find themselves in, and they especially don't care about the future of their host organism's species if that future depends on removing themselves from the gene pool. It is enough that what a gene codes for doesn't in any way inhibit the organism's ability to copy that gene. This is why we have genes that cause us to age. The genes that produce the effects of aging don't affect an organism until after they've already reproduced, and so they keep getting copied and they persist in the gene pool forever. In addition, genes can have little or no effect at all on the host animal and only modify other animals' behaviors through an extended phenotype in order to ensure they get copied or persist. The gaping behavior that baby birds exhibit is coded by a gene and coerces the parent bird's behavior into feeding them. This means birds have a gene whose phenotypic expression must include the reciprocal behavior of their parent, a feed me gene, so to speak. And so from this perspective, we can see that beef tastes good to humans because cows carry a novel gene that modifies human behavior into continuously reproducing the tastiest cows. I'll repeat that. Cows have a gene that all but guarantees that we will kill them prematurely to eat them, because that gene also guarantees that we will keep reproducing those cows, thus copying that gene. Genes that ensure they get copied are genes that persist. Now let's get into how this all bears out in the simulation. To implement a food system, I first needed to give my agents some sensory neurons that detect nearby food in some way, should they choose to incorporate those sensations into their network. I found the most efficient way to do this was just to place all of the available food into a KD tree. If you're already familiar with KD trees, this is probably obvious to you. For those that aren't, it should suffice to say that a KD tree is a data structure that sorts objects in space by their proximity to one another, kind of like how zip codes help the post office determine where a package should go, by first narrowing down all possible locations into easily sortable nested bins, where adjacent areas have sequential zip codes. That way, they don't have to search through all possible addresses in the country to find the closest sorting facility. The food sensor neurons have the ability to query the KD tree for the closest food to the agent's current position. Given an X and Y coordinate for the nearest food, the sensor neuron can return the X and Y components of a unit vector pointing from the agent's current location to that food, thus satisfying the implementation condition I'm maintaining that all sensors return a value between -1 and 1. This is so that the neural networks aren't artificially biased for some kinds of sensor neurons over others, and it is only through dendritic weightings that sensors can compete to drive behavior. To seek and obtain food, agents will have to evolve dendritic connections between their food sensor neurons and their motor neurons. I will not do this for them. Okay, so what's the value of food in the simulation, and why should an agent ever bother with it? Well, rather than giving the agent some kind of cost function that artificially optimizes their behavior for eating, I simply made it such that reproduction now only occurs when an agent eats. If an agent eats a food, it immediately splits into two agents, and the daughter agent will be an almost perfect copy of the parent, just with some random mutations. That's the only reward, so to speak, and the agents aren't incentivized per se to reproduce. It's just the only way their genes will persist, because, and crucially, their lifetimes are finite. If an agent never eats, it never reproduces, and its genes die along with that agent at the end of its natural lifespan. Since agents can reproduce at any time, I've done away with the artificial generation condition from part 1. Now agents just have a lifespan that starts to tick away from the moment of their birth. I haven't yet implemented anything that can lengthen an agent's lifespan and make tortoises from hares, but I have implemented something that can significantly shorten it. In just the same way that food works in the simulation, there are also hazards that exist in a KD tree that dedicated sensor neurons can query. If an agent comes near a hazard, that hazard will shorten their lifespan, and the closer they are to this hazard, the more life they lose, such that agents can really only live for a second or so next to the hazard. And just as with all the other survival criteria, the agents will not know any of this ab initio. If they evolve hazard avoidance behavior, it will only be because the genes that produce that behavior are either copied more frequently or persist for longer periods of time. As we will see, avoiding hazards will satisfy the latter condition, but not the former. When the simulation first starts, all of the agents are given completely random networks with no preferred behaviors, and food starts to grow in random locations. Agents that eat this food produce offspring, and natural selection is already starting to take hold. After a time, all of the agents from Generation 0 die at the same time, and so now the only agents that are left are the offspring of agents that ate food. If we allow this to run for a while, each generation of offspring seems to get better and better at finding and consuming food. You'll notice there's a group of yellow agents that has evolved a strategy that only moves in the Y direction to gather food. And this works for them because there simply isn't enough environmental pressure to exclusively select for more complicated behavior. At this stage, I'm going to start adding hazards, and just for fun, I'm going to make a nearly impassable barrier that separates the world into two halves. Maybe this is like a river of some sort. Right now, the agents aren't doing much to avoid the hazards because they don't know what those are, and so they dive right into the hazard zone to grab the food that spawns there, and they basically just die there. With this new environmental pressure creating a bottleneck on available food, it's only a matter of time before the yellow species goes extinct. Eventually, all of the remaining agents settle into an equilibrium state, avoiding hazards and eating food whenever it's safe to do so. If we look at the neural network of one of these agents, it can seem overly complicated at first, but with careful study, we can see that there's actually some clever computational tricks happening here. First, to review, the gray neurons labeled N0, N1, and such are just adder neurons. They combine the input values of any dendrites that terminate at them, and then output the combined sum of those inputs. Green dendrites have positive weights, and red dendrites have negative weights. Blue neurons are sensory neurons, and so SFX and SFY are the neurons that sense the components of the unit vector pointing to the nearest food, and SHX is the sensory neuron that senses the X component of a unit vector pointing at the nearest hazard. This agent, and in fact all of the surviving agents at this stage of the simulation, doesn't employ the Y component of the hazards vector, which is interesting. SAL is a simple neuron that always returns a value of 1, and finally the pink neurons MVX and MVY control the movement of the agent in the X and Y directions, respectively. I find that the easiest way to understand what these neural networks are coding for is to start from the sensory neurons and work outward until they terminate at a motor neuron. The food sensory neurons are more or less directly controlling the motion of the agent with positively weighted dendrites, such that an agent's preferred motion will almost always be in the direction of the nearest food. The sense food Y neuron passes through an intermediary adder neuron first, but since its dendritic connection to the adder is positively weighted, and the adder's connection to the Y motor neuron is also positive, this is essentially direct control. However, there is a small negative component coming from another calculation elsewhere in the network, and we'll get to that shortly. Now, the hazard sensory connections are much more interesting because, again, these agents have opted to employ only the X component sensory neuron and not the Y component. In this agent, the negative weightings connecting the sense hazard neuron to both motor neurons ensures that the agent always moves diagonally away from any hazard that it senses. But if you'll recall from our environmental setup, this is precisely the behavior that's most adaptive. On either side of our hazardous river, moving diagonally away from the nearest hazard is always the shortest path out of the river. Now, it's not enough for an agent to always seek out food until the hazard avoidance behavior overrides all other behaviors, because food is somewhat scarce. As you can see in the simulation, quite a lot of food piles up in the river because the agents are avoiding it. As a result, competition for food in the safe zone has selected for the somewhat risky behavior of occasionally diving into the river to snatch some nearby food when it's available, but avoiding the river entirely if the food is simply too far away. And this is what's being coded for in the rest of the agent's neural net. This seemingly discordant mess of connections between the adder neurons is essentially a decision tree that results in an override condition to hazard avoidance behavior to seek out food in the river if it can be done so with relative safety. I want to re-emphasize at this point that I didn't program any of this behavior directly. I simply created the environment and the available neurons that an agent might use, and the agents wired themselves up by means of the environmental selection pressures on random mutations. Occasionally, a mutant agent will evolve with different weightings on their hazard avoidance decision tree and dive right into the river to exploit all of its resources. This results in a momentary burst of offspring from that original mutant, and for a snapshot of time during one of these forays, it can be said that both strategies of gene survival, that of living for a long time by avoiding hazards but reproducing less frequently, or that of reproducing so often that hazards don't matter, are more or less equally represented in the environment. In nature, animals that adopt one or the other of these strategies are sometimes called K strategists or R strategists, respectively. R strategists in nature are the colonizers, the opportunists, the generalists. However, the environment I've designed can't actually support R strategists for very long, and they mostly just go extinct. One can imagine that if my hazards weren't so toxic, R strategists might actually find a way to colonize the opposite side of the river and evolve back into K strategists. And in fact, in another iteration of this same simulation, that did happen briefly. In this video, we witnessed two common strategies that genes might employ to persist in nature. Either they ensure the survival of the host animal for as long as possible, or they ensure the host animal reproduces so often that long-term survival isn't relevant. We also witnessed speciation occur as a result of an impassable barrier that naturally segregated one species into two distinct gene pools. This is in fact the only way that speciation can occur in nature. Gene flow between two related populations has to cease for long enough for the accumulated mutations in each of the newly segregated populations to comprise two distinct species. My simulations don't have anything like gene flow, as all the reproduction is asexual, but the general result is the same. The two isolated populations become less and less like each other. But I think the most compelling result of the simulation is the spontaneous evolution of decision trees that allow an agent to reprioritize its behavior under certain conditions. I mentioned earlier in the video that I haven't yet implemented anything that can lengthen the lifespan of an agent. In the future, I hope to implement 3 different kinds of food. In addition to the normal food that simply causes a reproduction event, I plan to implement a food type that lengthens an agent's life, but does not result in a reproduction event. I also plan to create a food type that's toxic, and so while it still causes a reproduction event, it also shortens the parent agent's lifespan. This way, 3 different strategies might evolve to keep genes in the environment, and it will be interesting to see how these strategies compete with one another. Hopefully it doesn't take another year for part 3 to come out, but I can't make any promises. In the meantime, if you want to reproduce what I've done here, I dive to much greater depth into how the code works in part 1. Like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content, and leave a comment if you tackle this yourself and evolve interesting behaviors in your own simulations.